So I met Mrs. George yesterday at our swim club, and I guess I'll talk more about that in the second video, because we were only able to have one interaction. Because her daughters are the same age as me, or around the same age, I felt as though Mrs. George, like with our conversation and everything, and also my previous experience talking to her, was that she had a pretty good understanding of how the high school, like American high school system works. Her oldest daughter, Ella, my friend, is about to graduate, so Mrs. George has seen the process of American education from start to finish for the first time, so she wasn't really surprised by a lot of what I had to say about my experience. But I've also had many conversations with her over the years about my classes and whatnot, so mostly when we talked, it was about her experience. And I've also never heard like her full experience before, so it was really cool to have that kind of conversation with her. She confirmed that she did do high school in Hong Kong from freshman to senior year, and when she said what high school she went to, she was talking about her high school, and she also mentioned an international school, and I googled like a Hong Kong international school, and it's still a pretty prominent school in Hong Kong even today, where they have sections of the school scattered around Hong Kong that are all designated to specific like countries. So there's an American school, she said there's a German Swiss school, there's the English school, so there are a bunch of different schools, but I don't remember if she said she went to that one or if she was just talking about the school in general. But it is a pretty like world-renowned school, so that was really cool. But she did mention that her school is very diverse in nature, so if I didn't hear her correctly, it is very likely that she went to that international school in Hong Kong. And she said her first complaint about the school was that they had to wear uniforms. She also said that her school followed the same structure as schools in England, Scotland, and Wales, so that the students from her school were, I guess, qualified, you could say, to go to college in the United Kingdom, which is really awesome, because then they wouldn't be held behind in any way or held back from continuing in higher education in their native country. She said that the types of classes that they had were, the first class she mentioned was that they had Mandarin and Cantonese lessons, which I thought was really cool, because not only were they like studying the curriculum of their country of origin, but they were also blending the kind of lessons that like they were blending like the culture of the place in which they were studying with also their home culture. She said that they had a variety of electives like needlework, home economics, and woodshop, which I definitely didn't have when I was in high school. We had basic like technology courses and art classes and music classes, which they also had, but they had more of those kind of specialized skill kind of classes, which is really cool. I asked her if they had like split classes specifically for each gender, so they'd encourage girls to take more of the like, I asked if they encouraged girls to take more of those needlework, home economics classes, and encouraged boys to take more of like engineering, math, and woodshop type classes, and she said no, they didn't prevent girls or boys from taking any kind of class. And she said there were a couple of boys in her home economics class that ended up as really good cooks, and Mrs. George also took the woodshop class, so there wasn't any kind of like gender discrimination in the kind of classes that they were allowed to take, which is really awesome. She said that PE was mandatory, which kind of sucks because it wasn't for me. But the PE that they had in her school was a lot more extensive and intense than the kind of like PE education I know they had at my high school. She said that they played a bunch of different games that we'll talk about next, but they had like lots of cross-country running, and they had lots of endurance work and a lot of that stuff, which I'm really happy that I didn't have to do, but they had that for her. I asked, or I didn't specifically ask, but she never mentioned if teachers moved from class to class or if the students moved from class to class. Because in American public schools, you have students moving from classroom to classroom. Like, teacher A will be teaching math in one room, but then teacher B will be teaching English the next period in another room. I wasn't sure if, I still don't know if her school did that kind of rotational subject kind of work, because in my studies of the Japanese language, I know that it's common in Japan for teachers to move from class to class, and the students will be in the same classroom all day, but I don't know, so maybe I'll ask her that later. The kinds of things that Mrs. George said she did for fun, or most kids in her high school did for fun, was that a lot of the kids belonged to clubs or sports or stuff, but those kinds of after-school activities weren't mandatory, and they weren't as big of a deal as some people might think that they are in American schools now, because a lot of students I know do those kinds of activities to boost resumes, to help college applications and stuff like that. So they can kind of be a big deal, but they weren't. Mrs. George said that they weren't a big deal for her. She said that she did water polo for a year and absolutely hated it, but she said that she did field hockey all through high school, and she was really good at it, which is kind of cool. I never knew that about her. She said that she mostly talked about like the kinds of different sports and activities that the school provided for through their physical education program. The school, she said, had a pool, they had fields and stuff, but because the city is a city in nature and it's not like American suburbs where you have lots of land for schools to like build stadiums or baseball diamonds or tennis courts or stuff like that, so a lot of what they did in PE was on concrete. She talked about a game called netball, which she said was a British game, and I didn't recognize it at first, but when she started describing it, I remember that we played a game really similar to it in middle school PE. It's like you have two nets on either side, which is netball, and then instead of running with a ball like you would in most any other sport I could think of, you grab the ball and then you can pivot, but you have to be stationary when you hold the ball, and then you can pass it to your teammates. So it encourages like teamwork and that kind of stuff like that, which is pretty cool. So she talked about another kind of game. I forget what name she called it, but it's like baseball, and you have like a shorter, fatter type bat, but you don't use any catching mitts, but other than that, still like baseball with the different bases. So those are kinds of like the activities that they played in PE, and I wouldn't be surprised if kids played them after school and stuff like that, like people do in America, where like after school kids will meet up and play soccer and whatnot. So the next thing she talked about was that she took a trip to California for her field hockey team, and there was a tournament in the United States, and they toured all through California, and she said that they stayed in like homes of host families, which is really cool, so you get more of like an American experience than you would if you stayed in a hotel. She also said that as a part of this trip, they got to spend like one day start to finish in an American school, which is really cool because at the age of 15, she was able to see like how Americans go about their school day, and she was able to like have that cultural experience and compare it to how she went through her school day. She also said it was one of the best experiences of her life, and that's because of like the different kind of like cultural experience she had during this trip. For after-school events, she said that they didn't really have pep rallies like they had at my school. At my school, they had pep rallies, I think, once every trimester, even though our school was split into semesters because there were 3 different sports seasons. So there'd be one in the middle, like homecoming time, in the fall, where they'd have pep rallies for like the football team and all the other sports teams. They also have pep rallies in the winter where we'd all be in the gym, and then all the different sports teams would cut them out and do stuff like that. But they never had stuff like that in her high school. She also didn't mention if they had like school dances, like a prom or a homecoming, like most American high schools do. So that'll be interesting if I can ask her about that later. So the kinds of system that she referred to it was an O-level and an A-level like subject tests. These are the kind of subject tests that they use in the United Kingdom, and because the way her curriculum was set up in Hong Kong, they mirrored that kind of United Kingdom curriculum. That way, like I said earlier, the students from her school could still go to college in the United Kingdom. So she said you had to pass all of the O-level tests in order to take the A-level test, but you could only take 4 A-level exams. When she brought up the O-level test, it reminded me of the owl tests from Harry Potter, because the owls were like the standardized tests that they had in Harry Potter at like their junior year or whatever it was, around that time. And she had to take an O-level, so I thought that was kind of funny. But she said only like the best of the students, like the best and the brightest and all those kinds of super smart people were the ones that took the 4 like maximum amount of A-level exams. She compared these tests to AP tests instead of like an SAT or something, because they were subject tests instead of taking one test that was a accumulation of a bunch of different subjects, like the ACT is or the SAT is, with the different science sections or math sections or English sections. You had one O-level test or one A-level test that was on language and literature, and you had one that was on math, and you had one that was on etc., etc. So they were more like AP tests than they were like an SAT or something like that, as a way to kind of compare them. So in addition, I asked her about like test prep and how people, how she prepared for them. So she said during the regular high school curriculum, her teachers did a lot of the test prep in class, but she did have to study a lot outside of class because there were a lot of tests that she had to take. It wasn't just one accumulation test that the SAT was, because there were the many different exams that you had to pass in order to take the next set of exams and stuff like that. So, but she did say that teachers would be administering like practice tests during class and giving them study materials and stuff, which I found extremely different from my experience, because from my experience, even though I was like an honors AP student, I felt as though my teachers didn't prepare me for these SATs or ACTs. I had to go out of my way in order to accumulate study materials, and my family had to sign me up for tutoring and stuff like that in order to feel prepared for these tests. And to compare it to her experience where the teachers were prepping them for these tests, I think it's really unfortunate for American students, because unless you're in these honors AP classes that are giving you higher skills in order to take these tests at a higher level and more likely to succeed, like you have to have the money and the opportunity and the time in order to get tutors and outside materials to study for these tests. Whereas the school, if the school is trying to promote like educational success, the school should be providing students with these kinds of materials to set them up for success. Otherwise, if you can't afford it or you don't have the time, like I said, like you're not going to succeed on these tests unless you're some sort of like prodigy or something like that. So I thought that was really interesting, and I wish American schools would take a lesson from like schools in other countries in that kind of area, because we should be better preparing our students for tests as part of the curriculum instead of wishing it upon themselves to take it all on their own. So when I was in high school, I worried a lot about my GPA and my tests and being properly set up in order to go to college and stuff like that. She said, yeah, like she worried about that stuff, but her biggest worry was making friends, which I thought is so different compared to a lot of the people I know's experience. When you're living in such, she talked about it in a way where it was like, to summarize, when you're living in such a diverse area and you go to such a diverse school, it's really hard to find people who are like you, to have these commonalities in order to build friendships quicker. But it was really, she said it was hard for her to make friends, and she did make friends, but she just saw it as more of a challenge, as she probably wouldn't have had as big of a challenge if she'd been going to school with people that were all just like her. And she also compared these kinds of troubles with those of her daughters. And she thinks that there are a lot more worries that her daughters have in high school than she had in high school. So making friends is like one thing, but she said that her daughters battle a lot with finding acceptance because of the way that people worry about like their views and their perceptions. And she also thinks social media had a lot to do with that. Because like back in the day, when she went back in the day, they didn't have social media, so she didn't really have to worry about that kind of 24/7 like communication and the kind of worries and like Instagram making face kind of concerns. She didn't have to worry about any of that stuff, so she could focus more on her grades, but she also said she didn't worry much about her grades as she did about making friends. She said she also worried about like the standardized tests and how she could prepare for them, but she studied for them and she said she did well, so in hindsight it wasn't as big of a concern to her as making friends. We also had a pretty lengthy conversation on social media and technology in schools and like the concerns she had for her kids, but I'm going to talk more about that in the second video because I think that has to do more with that kind of experience. She brought up how students act in the classroom and the kind of like leniency with discipline she saw with her daughter's teachers. She said when she was in school, her teachers were really strict about respect and classroom protocols, and she said if she talked out of turn or something like that, her teacher would throw like a chalkboard eraser at her and stuff like that. And she and her mom laughed, but oh my gosh, if one of my teachers did that, I would have freaked out. But from her experience, students wore uniforms and they always raised their hands to ask for permission. But when she was, I guess, observing her daughter's classroom, I think they allow parents to do that in my district. But in her daughter's classroom, she saw that students were moving around during lesson, leaving to go to the bathroom on their own, and like not paying attention or on their phones all day. And from our conversation, it was very evident that she values like respect for authority, and the respect for education and respect for a proper classroom learning environment. But she thinks that kids like nowadays don't have that same respect. And I think part of her perspective comes from where she went to school and also the generational differences between kids now and kids then. Because her school was like a private school and they had that kind of private education. But in a sense, I also agree with her perspective because I think there's something to be said about strictness in the classroom, and because like rules exist to promote discipline and focus to better ensure student learning. But from my classroom experience, I also see that like students can be extremely disrespectful to teachers, and also see little to no administrative consequences, which is really unfortunate. But with this kind of sense, how I also agree with like my school and how they went with this movement to promote a positive reinforcement of behaviors instead of positive or negative punishments for undesirable behaviors, as seen from like the behaviorist perspective. And I agree with the research as discussed in the textbook that kind of backs up this switch of this. I think we changed the name of detentions to attentions, so that instead of the detention as a negative consequence or a negative punishment for an undesired behavior, your attention is brought to the fact that you can change this behavior. So yes, while I agree with this kind of movement to positive reinforcement instead of punishment, I think there needs to be a balance between punishment and reinforcement in the classroom to ensure that students are disciplined and are also in a constructive learning environment. So from my conversation with Mrs. George, her overall high school experience was so incredibly unique and so incredibly different from anyone I'll probably ever talk to in my whole life. And I had a great time talking with her about her and her life experience because I've never talked with her on this kind of level instead of just talking about like the basic stuff about like, oh, how was your day, stuff like that, because that's usually what we talk about when we see each other. But from our conversation, her experience may not have entirely been different from those of other private schools, but the circumstances and the location of her education were what made her specific experience so unique. And I think that from this conversation, I learned that just because someone is learning in a place that's entirely different from anyone else's doesn't mean that like their culture has to change. Because of the kind of curriculum and the way that they structured their school in Hong Kong, she was able to preserve her English culture through the way that they taught like lessons and structured like preparation for these standardized tests in order to set them up to go back. But I also think this relates to like the cultural relevant pedagogy because her teachers they upheld academic success and maintained the English culture through using the same curriculum as in the UK. And her teachers also encouraged cultural consciousness by incorporating aspects of different cultures in lessons, such as in their Chinese language lessons and their different classes and the way they incorporate different kinds of sports into their physical education curriculum. And as a kind of a conclusion of this, I think the way students are educated is a big part of culture, because through education, traditions and attitudes of the community or the culture or the kind of place that you're learning are inflicted on the students, and I think that through this, education preserves culture.